Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Vlad Barbalat, who is the president of Liberty Mutual Investments and the chief investment officer of Liberty Mutual Group, which is one of the largest property and casualty insurers in the world. Vlad is a former student of mine from 20 plus years ago, and it's great to be connected again. Vlad, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show and would like to start with your journey as a young immigrant from the former Soviet Union before we get into the world of insurance and investing and what it means to be a leader in the business world. What's the journey been like for you?
Look, I would say first and foremost, I'd like to say this. My story is remarkably unremarkable. And that's a credit to the United States of America, because in any other place, my story or your story, Vasant, or many other stories would have been remarkable on their own. But here, they're just one of many. They're just one. They're lost in the endless pile of success.
True that, as I would say, indeed.
Endless pile of success that is the United States, despite its flaws.
Yeah, indeed. What a country. All right, so let's get started.
Sure. Well, I should, given that introduction, start by saying I was a student in your class.
Indeed. I remember that fondly.
I'm not sure you do, but I was a student in your class. It was a fantastic class. I even remember vaguely the classroom we were in. I think it was on the Opera Concourse, the UC elevator button. Yeah. So I have many fond memories. We'll talk about the school, I'm sure. But about me, I guess I'll start by saying I came to the United States in 1990 as a refugee from one of the former republics of the Soviet Union, Moldova. Probably has gotten a little more press recently given its proximity to Ukraine than it has before. Basically a country pretty small, sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. Came when I was 10, like I said, with my parents. At that point in time, the Soviet Union still existed, collapsed about a year after we left. It was also that window of time where Jews were allowed to leave. Gorbachev at the time opened the door, so to speak. And so there was a mass migration in that very brief period of time where there was that opportunity to leave. And so we were one of the fortunate ones who were accepted as refugees to the United States. I distinctly remember both arriving in John F. Kennedy Airport here in New York for the first time, and I also remember kind of the trip itself from the city I lived in, Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova, on a train to Moscow. It was, getting off the train, getting on the plane. So as a 10-year-old kid, you kind of don't remember many things, but this one was memorable. And so ended up in a small town in Connecticut. That was kind of the first landing spot, Manchester, Connecticut. We had an organization that had helped us settle for the first kind of landing spot. And my parents, did the whole immigrant experience. They were both working every job they could find. My dad became, I think his first job was cleaning a mechanic's shop. My mom packed bags at ShopRite. And I found myself in school where in a small town, kids weren't exactly familiar with people from the Soviet Union. So that was quite an experience.
And what was your English like?
Oh, my English. So that's interesting. I don't remember myself, but my parents say is that I was as silent as a fish, was the way they spoke, for about a year and a half to 2 years. And then all of a sudden I started speaking. Mm-hmm. And I don't really remember that. I remember interacting somehow. And I remember, for example, my first class where the school had the small group of kids who needed English as a second language. And I actually not quite sure how we interacted because we obviously spoke very poor English. And I remember there was a girl who became a friend of mine. She was from Bangladesh. And then there were a couple of kids from other places. We somehow communicated. And so, from there, after, about 2 years or so of my parents getting their bearings, we ended up in New Jersey, where my dad found what I guess would describe as his first real job, a little closer to his actual profession of engineering. And so ended up in New Jersey where I grew up, ultimately, moved around New Jersey, first in Edison, New Jersey, for those that are familiar, and then ultimately East Brunswick, New Jersey, where I grew up and had, a pretty typical New Jersey experience is the way I describe it, which is I was a bridge and tunnel kid coming into New York all the time in high school, got my fake ID, hung out at a variety of New York clubs, all while in high school. I don't think that happens anymore. And then ultimately, somehow, some way, made my way to NYU, which was a stretch, a reach, certainly beyond my expectations. That changed my life, getting here. It was a transformative experience.
How did NYU change your life?
But in every way. It's hard to capture that, but I would say that the most important thing is it allowed me to raise my own horizons. It allowed me to dream about things that I otherwise wouldn't even know to dream about. And that's a function of the special secret sauce, I think, that can happen to a young person when they find a ecosystem, typically a university, where they both get to see things they haven't seen before, be surrounded by people who make you better, make you more competitive, and then people who take interest in you and again allow you to dream the next dream. So just like I said, NYU was a bit of a dream and a reach for me that I wouldn't have expected myself to see myself in. Everything that came after that and during it was also exactly that, because at no point in time in my early NYU years did I have a plan of, the things exactly I'm going to want to accomplish once I leave the school. It was all a process of finding myself, but finding myself in an ecosystem that allowed me to find the better self than otherwise possible.
It's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking of my own. I'm an immigrant as well, and I came here in my early 20s. But I recall this, thinking at some point that the people I surrounded myself with at some point, the thing I learned from them was to think bigger. And you talked about what to dream about. It was, very similar, that because I grew up in India and no one really sort of told us to think big. It was the furthest thing from your mind. It was more like, children should be seen and not heard. And plus India had sort of also I was born 8 years after the British left, right? So, there was still sort of this thing, the weight that hung over. There was a lot of optimism, but no one really taught you to think big. That's only something that I became much more aware of in America. So it's interesting you say that.
100%. And I actually think that kids of immigrants who are struggling to gain their footing. So I think about, what's it like to come when you're almost 40 years old to a different country, and why do you do it, and kind of all the hardships. As a kid who observes that, you internalize it not because you necessarily are doing it consciously, but you're just internalize certain things. And the way you're taught to be, in some senses, what you've described is you just want to be practical, like do the practical things. Dreaming big is nowhere on the radar for, I think, immigrant parents who are struggling to make ends meet, to gain that foothold. And so when they think about their kids, it's about practicality. And so, you're never going to see parents advocating in those situations, go get a a liberal arts degree, or no, it was always what are you going to do after, what's your job going to be? How are you going to survive? But dreaming big, I think, comes very much from being inspired, and being inspired isn't necessarily a issue of being practical. It's about surrounding yourself with people who let you see things that you otherwise wouldn't have seen.
Were you inspired by any writers, people, parents,
Yeah.
teachers, whatever?
Yeah, it's hard to pin down any one individual, because I've been fortunate to have many people who've been an incredibly positive influence in my life. I mean, certainly, again, seeing the example and the actuality of my parents struggling to make ends meet and having uprooted their lives in many ways for me, but certainly for themselves too. That left a permanent, I think, imprint on me, and knowing that you have to somehow validate that struggle. You have to not let it go for nothing. What I always was very interested in, for one reason or another, is history, geopolitics, things of that nature. And so I just always ate up stories. And so I read a lot, and I consumed, even for back then, I consumed a lot of information, and began to form just kind of opinions about things. And maybe that is, again, a function of watching literally the Soviet Union collapse on TV, and understanding that, that could have been there. Instead, I'm here. And putting that into the context of my own, even as a kid, experience in that 10-year window of where I lived in Moldova, both the good and the bad. And there was, plenty of bad, which you only understand once you're removed from it. Because again, I think as a kid, you just take things as they are. So you take the rabid anti-Semitism that existed in the Soviet Union, explicit, violent. But that was just, in my mind, that's what it is. Like, that's part of my day, so to speak. But as you grow older and you're not in that every day, you reflect back, and these things do shape and form you. So I'm not really answering your question, but I guess I would say I've had lots of positive influence along the way. But at the school in particular, it was just seeing both my peers and professors who were interesting, who had interesting aspirations or were researching interesting things and taught interesting classes. And it was a little bit of like, why not me? And it's not a question you ask yourself unless you see that. What do you think?
Yeah, lots of things, actually. But one of the things, since you mentioned anti-Semitism, I just want to push on that, because that's in the air a lot these days. And, you talked about being rabid in the Soviet Union. What's your experience about what it was like here, and how has that changed?
So it's a complicated question, because I think in the United States, anti-Semitism has been certainly a less prominent than it is today. And I mean, today we're talking in the midst of an explosion of anti-Semitism and hatred in general in society. But my practical experience, I do remember when I was kind of in my early years of America, I do remember the classic stuff happening to me. It was largely in the schools where kids would make remarks, or do the kind of the swastikas being passed around, or throw the pennies in front of you, all the kind of classic stuff. But again, I kind of look at it now with different eyes than I did back then, because back then I was coming from a place of, this was something that I was almost familiar with, and it wasn't violent, which was a change in itself. And so I think the internalization of that back then was, okay, this is this is just kind of like gravity, just is always there, but at least it's not violent, which is what it was in the Soviet Union. And then as I got kind of older, I think it recedes, and in many ways.
So would it be fair to say that was sort of more ignorance as opposed to the hatred?
Yes, what? Because I think children, and by children, I don't know where you draw that line, but kids in general, kids are mean. Kids are ignorant. Kids say stuff that doesn't necessarily strike me as a mortal danger. What you want to ensure is that all kids grow up to be good human beings. Of course, that is a much taller task, but I don't think that I equate something that a 10-year-old or 11-year-old or 12-year-old says out of sheer stupidity as necessarily reflective of, their finality of their character or anything of the sort. It does speak to, again, the undertones, but I talk about this a lot. I don't believe that you can eradicate hate. Hate can either spill out into the open or it can be chased into the shadows. The only way it goes back into the shadows is if civil society at large stands together against it unequivocally, against all hate. If there are inconsistencies, if there are preferences, if some hate is allowed but others not, then hate will be exploited. It will find its way. It's a little bit like water that way. It will find the way to find the crack to flow through. And I also, again, I don't really believe that there is a concept where hate can be eliminated, mandated to be eliminated, or anything of the sort, but it can live in the shadows where it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable as a whole, and civil society has to stand together to make that happen. It can't be any one single group. Otherwise, we just get picked off.
Yeah, I mean, true enough. I think back of my own experiences. I remember hitchhiking from Kabul to London in the 70s.
Wow,
through Europe.
How long did that take?
3 months. But Europe at that time was incredibly racist, especially Eastern Europe. It's changed so much for the better over the last 40 years, where it's not okay to be overtly racist anymore like it used to be. So, Vlad, let's come back to your university experience here in the U.S. You were here like 20 plus years ago, and I've been immersed in the university system for even longer. The mission of universities, in my opinion, was supposed to be about the pursuit of truth, but it seems to have morphed into something else recently. And talking about the truth, by the way, I just read a fascinating book by Gandhi called My Experiments with Truth, where he talks about his pursuit of the truth and nonviolence as the driver for justice and change. I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me, but I sometimes wonder whether universities have made the pursuit of truth subservient to, social issues and power dynamics and the need to make everyone feel, quote unquote, safe. What's your sense of what's happening in universities now compared to what it was like when you were a student?
Well, universities are certainly in the news as we sit here now, and I haven't necessarily been thinking about this stuff as much as I have been recently, again, because of the recent events. And I have, we can go on this topic forever. I guess I would start with universities in the United States, I think, are one of the greatest crown jewels of this country. They're a product of, hundreds of years of shaping and evolving and morphing. And they are a true jewel of the United States that the rest of the world looks to in driving, presumably, progress. Progress that is both driving what I guess I would describe hard progress, effectively prosperity, but also progress in our search for the softer sciences of the best way to organize society, or the best way to shape the way we prepare young people to enter into a constantly morphing world. Criticism is important, but so is building. If we don't teach young people how to build, they're not going to build. They're just going to tear stuff down. And I think we need to acknowledge some of these challenges that we have today, where we've had less of the building and more of the criticism of what we have.
Is it also the coddling? What's your view on that? Right. I mean, one of my colleagues has written about that extensively.
Look, it's hard. It's hard not to agree with that. We have, I think, at large, because I hate to make these generalizations because,
So you've got kids, right?
I've got kids.
How old are your kids?
I've got a 15-year-old, a 12-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And this is where I struggle because, it's very easy to turn on the news or look at Twitter or X and be convinced that the world is a particular way. But then you step away from those things and you kind of look at like your actual reality, and not all of it is always true. So I'm pretty content, if not happy, with the schooling that my kids get, and they're in public schools, in good public schools. But it's not what I would observe if I went to X and kind of looked at all the, the information, the outrage often that you get on from every direction. But I think it is absolutely true that as a society as a whole, we've sort of moved away from describing certain, what I believe are virtues, like resilience or bravery of inquiry, of disagreement, constructive disagreement, civic disagreement, civil disagreement, to, things like that are all forms of coddling. There's so many words you can use, but just be safe, or just don't push yourself too hard. I don't think that works. I don't think it works on the people that want to push themselves hard, the kids that want to push themselves hard, they will do it anyway. What you're probably doing, though, is you are giving kids who could otherwise be influenced to see and do better, to set higher expectations for themselves. You're giving them excuses from an early age to take an easier path, to say, but I need to take care of this, the soft stuff first. I don't have to push myself. I should stay up past a certain hour to perfect my work because I need to take care of myself. There's a balance there. You don't want to, you don't want to create conditions where it becomes some kind of mad race for achievement that is forced, but you also don't want to dissuade people from the concept that achievement, that excellence is a very good thing. You should want that. You should want uncompromising excellence in all parts of society. And ultimately, children are the fuel for that future society. Inevitably, they're going to grow up and change things and undo some of the things that was done by the previous generation, et cetera, et cetera. But if you teach them that everything is actually bad and your sole goal is to criticize everything and be safe and not take risk, I think you get strange outcomes, because you'll never suppress the people that are willing to take risks. They'll still be there. They'll still be pushing and challenging, but they'll be more of an outlier than you would otherwise have. And so again, I think actually, ironically, it creates a more exclusionary society rather than an inclusive one, where when you tell everyone to just be safe.
Yeah, I think triggers kind of also have gone a little far, right? That they've sort of resulted in something pretty similar where you just get upset easily. There's a little bit of, I guess, what you went through, what I went through, it's just sort of good for you. Take a few knocks and you'll learn how to deal with the variety of people that you'll encounter in life.
100%.
So,
because as you go through life, I mean, certain things don't change. You encounter great people, inspiring people, bad people. That doesn't change. The difference is maybe as an adult, you get a little bit more leeway of the circles you traffic in than when you do as a kid. So you can avoid maybe some of the stuff you want to avoid. But yeah, the idea that you should shelter young people, never mind college students, from things that make them uncomfortable I think is a very bad idea.
Let's continue with your journey. Like you talked about, your immigrant experience, growing up, everything. So what's happened since, you graduated from here? Good things, obviously. So tell us about, what it's like, running the investment side of Liberty Mutual and how you actually ended up in that position.
Sure. Well, again, going back at every stage of my career, I kind of couldn't have planned what came next. I was always a planner. Once I graduated NYU, I kind of talked about the fact that I wasn't a planner when I got here. But from school, I ended up at Goldman Sachs. Spent the next 13 years of my career there, doing a variety of different things. Always within the securities division. Always kind of on the risk-taking side of things, and really didn't expect to leave. I loved New York. I loved Goldman. It was a fantastic place to grow up professionally. One really can't ask for anything better. It was incredibly high energy, incredibly talented people, incredibly ambitious people. Got to travel the world, got to learn a ton, and more than ever got to expand my horizons in ways I could have never, ever imagined, even a decade prior. And in 2015, kind of had an opportunity to take a role at a hedge fund in Boston. GMO was the name of the firm, Jeremy Grantham's organization. And it was an overwhelming opportunity. And even though I never really envisioned myself leaving New York or Goldman, it felt like an opportunity I had to pursue. It was very much in line with my interests. You asked me before kind of about my early interests. They were always rooted in politics and markets and kind of strategy and things like that. And so the opportunity to go run a global macro hedge fund just felt unbelievably attractive. And so I uprooted my family from New York. My wife at the time was finishing her fellowship at Columbia. She's a surgeon. And I was lucky enough to have that moment line up with the fact that she was finished. And so that took me to Boston. I spent 2.5 years at GMO. We can spend some time talking about my learnings about what it means to take risk within an institution like Goldman Sachs, then on the, so to speak, buy side hedge fund, GMO. But ultimately,
talk about that. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Well, look, I think there's a well-known difference when you are a risk taker on the sell side, so to speak. What you're ultimately able to do is trade, which means you spot opportunities in whatever markets you traffic in, and you're in to largely take risk that you think is attractive and close that risk when it becomes less attractive, and you're also managing ultimately your P&L. You have to be conscious of positions that go against you. You have to be conscious, frankly, of when to harvest positions and monetize them, because you're not in the business of taking risk on the balance sheet for a long time. And so what you don't end up doing, you may be a very astute market participant, but what you don't really do is construct portfolios. What you don't really do is synthesize into a single portfolio the investment objectives of other investors, right? Because when you're sitting at a trading desk on the sell side, you are the investor. There isn't a singular mandate that Goldman Sachs assigns to you in your risk taking. And so you are just an astute market participant. Take that to when you're running a fund. Well, all of a sudden, your constituency is very different. You have brought in a set of investors under a particular mandate, and that mandate is well defined. Further, your fund is just a little puzzle piece in their portfolios, which then have another mandate. And so it's a very different mindset that you must have in constructing a portfolio, therefore, of things that you perceived to be interesting in the marketplace that you can extract interesting returns from. But all of a sudden you have all these considerations that you just don't have when you're effectively a sharpshooter trader on the sell side. And that was a big practical lesson for me. I certainly understood the theory of it and making that transition, but the practicality of actually implementing that was different.
Let's say more, like how?
Yeah, well, look, you have investors that come into a vehicle, and obviously there's so many different investment vehicles, but they come into a vehicle, let's say in the case of the one I was managing, where it was meant to be a long-term macro hedge fund. Now, what does that mean, long-term macro hedge fund? Macro hedge funds tend to trade a lot. Well, in this case, the actual explicit mandate was to take long-term views, absorb volatility, and achieve excess returns based on these long-term perspectives, effectively saying that most market participants aren't able to absorb volatility in taking macro views. That sounds good on paper. In practice, you speak to your investors on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, and they're asking, questions about, well, give me an update on this trade, or give me an update on this position, or what transactions have you done around this position? And that's kind of awkward to talk about something that is meant to be, if you say is a 5-year position, to talk about it monthly based on whatever gyrations the market is experiencing. Further, the conversations tend to be around specific positions. They're very rarely about the totality of the portfolio. And I find this to be a forever flaw, I think or one of the quirks of markets.
Markets or people?
People. I guess it's people. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, because there's no end of flaws of people in investing.
Well, you're an investor. You're a market participant. Like, how many times will you get people asking you about a specific trade, a stock, a bond, a situation, whatever it is? People will always ask about something fairly narrow and specific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the answer to that is really complicated. So if you're at a cocktail party and someone asks you, "Hey, I had this investment come across my desk. What do you think?" How can I answer that without the totality of information that is required? Everything from, well, what is it that your particular investment objective is as an individual? What percent of your portfolio will this position represent? What is your risk tolerance? And if I answer your question kind of at the highest level, is this a good investment or not? It's a very incomplete answer, because the truth is, the way you construct the portfolio ultimately makes a difference. If it's a great investment, it should be really big, but does it fit your risk tolerance? What are the odds that your assessment that it's a great investment is actually right? Or then do you just take, if you're very skeptical about your ability to actually pick those good investments, shouldn't you just, find a way to index whatever that means for that particular situation, or get the broadest basket of these investments? So I think we naturally want to talk about something specific and tangible. Portfolios are harder to talk about. It's not as exciting. It's not as descriptive. It's not a story. Stories are about specific investments. And I find this quirk to be persistent. But it's one thing that you don't have to worry about when you're sitting on the sell side.
What happened after that? How'd you end up in an insurance company?
Yeah, I did not expect that either. So as I've said, I was, at GMO, and at the time met my now good friend and colleague, Niti Bala Johnson, who was also formerly at Goldman Sachs. And she had been early into her own transition into the insurance world from Goldman. And so she was the chief investment officer, and she and I had a number of breakfasts where we talked about the things that she is looking to do. And frankly, it was a eye-opening experience for me, because I never really thought about insurance capital pools in any concrete ways. I mean, obviously, I knew that they existed in abstract ways. Very much thought of them as kind of this fairly steady fixed income investing, basics, bread and butter kind of stuff. And so it was a learning opportunity for me to actually understand the incredibly important role insurance capital pools play in markets.
So just to sort of clarify for the listeners who may not have that sophistication. So when you talk about bread and butter stuff, you're basically talking about
bonds,
buying bonds,
buying and holding bonds, right? Like, so if that would be kind of the most. And by the way, many insurance companies still do exactly that. Mm-hmm. They buy a bond, they hold it to maturity, they collect their coupon, and then they do it again. And that is the entirety of the model, but that is not everybody. And the spectrum of insurance pools that take different approach to the way they invest their assets spans from at the most extreme Berkshire, of course, and Warren Buffett's obviously been very open about the beauty of that model of having the assets and the liabilities that generate the assets that can then be invested. He's been talking about it for as long as he's been Warren Buffett as we know him, to the other side of the spectrum of where actually the core business is truly insurance, very good at it. And there's a, inability for a variety of different reasons to actually pursue sophistication on the asset side of the balance sheet. And so you stick with that business model. Both are feasible. Both are appropriate for different companies with different objectives.
So define the Warren Buffett model a little bit. Let's flesh that out, because I find that fascinating, and I always wonder why every insurance company doesn't operate like that. It seems like a brilliant model to me. So I'm already pushing you to tell me why that's.
So Vasant, I find with age comes wisdom. I find that doing the simple things is by far the hardest. And that's what I meant by Warren doesn't have like some kind of secret that he's been hiding from. I mean, he's kind of figured out, well, hey, if I could have a product, insurance, where I am in the business of offering people protection against certain risks, and through that business, I generate float, which is the insurance premium, I can then take that and begin to generate investment return on that. I could fulfill my mission of, first and foremost, being there for my policyholders and ensuring that they're protected against the risks that I promised to protect them against. And then I get this wonderful second side of the business where I generate investment return, which then sets off this flywheel, which says, well, now I have more capital. I can write more insurance policies, because insurance, as it should be, is a very regulated business. Once I have more capital, I can write more insurance policies, which then generates more float, which then makes me a more relevant investor. And if you fast forward that, you ultimately get to this place where you become both. You actually become an incredibly important player in the capital markets, as Berkshire is, but you're also an incredibly important player in the insurance markets. Why is that? Well, because your capital base is massive. It's history of being profitable on the insurance side and then creating capital on the asset side. But there's one more piece here. It is about the fact that you compound that capital. This is where the magic is, right? Because if you dividend that capital out, if you use that capital in anything other than compounding, and there are times where you may want to do that, you are distracted from this kind of mission that you're on. But what Warren's done, he's done it for, 40, 50 years. And Berkshire is absolutely massive. I think the market cap of Berkshire is what? It's 600 billion or 700 billion these days on an enormous capital base.
Yeah, and so that's why I ask, like, what am I missing here, right? This is such a brilliant model. Why isn't every insurance company doing it, right? It's no secret. He's doing simple things, right? Compounding, making sure he's got float, by taking in more premium than, he's paying out in claims, not rocket science, like 101. And like you said, creates this flywheel, right? Yep. And, Berkshire Hathaway is Sharpe ratio, information ratio has been 20% better than the S&P, which is really impressive. It's not easy to outperform the S&P, right? So he's managed to do that, right? So how come everyone else isn't doing this?
The simple things are the hardest. Look, first of all, Berkshire is good at all sides of the business, right? So they're good at insurance. Geico's a formidable competitor, but they're also exceptional investors. And so the totality of the Berkshire enterprise is both. So you shouldn't forget that actually the insurance business is a huge component of the totality of that enterprise value as well. But I think it gets nuanced. It's not as obvious that everyone can replicate that model because you're a function of of the business you grow up in. So if you are a profitable insurer and that has been the composition of your team, your aptitude and acumen and frankly comfort with the investment side may be substantially less. And that's not an unreasonable proposition, by the way. I mean, if you think about what Berkshire does is they take a tremendous amount of risk, right? So I think they hold 8 or 9 large positions. That's at the outer extreme of how much risk is being taken on the investment portfolio, right? In order to do that, you have to have some very strong beliefs about why you should do that, because you could also blow up the entire enterprise by simply making bad investments. Case in point, financial crisis, an insurer like AIG got themselves into a lot of issues through the investment portfolio, right? So it's not as, when we look at successful...
Did that happen because they just did things that had incredible complexity that they didn't understand, right? As opposed to Buffett, right? Where
he does simple things, simple but very risky, right? Holding 8 positions in the sizes that he holds them in is very risky. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, so first and foremost, not all insurance enterprises are comfortable with meaningful investment risk because it is just simply not what they do. They are much more comfortable focusing on their sandbox of insurance and doing basically the bread and butter stuff on the asset side of their balance sheet. And I don't think it's always unreasonable to say that that is not the right thing to do. If you're not going to be able to do something well, then maybe you shouldn't. And I think that argument can be made for a whole swath of insurance enterprises. But then there's another component. It's the actual what you do with the capital, right? So Berkshire generally compounds. They don't dividend out. It kind of just goes back into the system, even though, of course, it's a public company. But it's not a highly traded one, and people don't hold Berkshire for the dividend. They hold it for the appreciation, which is expressed via the compounding of the capital. But if you're a typical publicly listed insurer, your shareholder base may actually hold your stock for a different reason. And therefore, the way you deal with your capital will be appropriate to your shareholder base. So if your shareholders expect stock buybacks, if your shareholders expect dividends, and that is the core reason of why they hold your stock, not because they expect growth or compounding of capital, well, you're definitionally in a different business than Berkshire.
Why do you, so this is going to be a really dumb question, but why do you care who your shareholders are?
Ooh, well, this can get complex. I mean, look, management teams of publicly listed companies, regardless of the industry they're in, certainly care about their stock price, both from job security to the way they get incentivized is going to be tied to the price of the stock. So you therefore care what your shareholders think and how to attract new shareholders. And so if you are, NVIDIA, you're not attracting shareholders by the virtue of your dividend. You're attracting shareholders by the virtue of your growth. If you are a bank or another financial services institution like an insurance company, people aren't buying your stock because you're going to double your revenues in 2 years. They're buying your stock largely for a dividend, for stability, and stock buybacks, effectively return of capital that is predictable and meets the bar. Well, if you're doing that, you're in a very different business than Berkshire because, well, as you generate that capital from either side of the business, the asset side or the liability side, what you have is then the propensity to distribute that capital via stock buybacks or via dividends. And so the compounding never happens. And that is pretty interesting, right? Because it's so simple.
I mean, you don't generate as much enterprise value, or do you?
Well, that's hard to say, right? You certainly don't generate it in the same way because you give it back to an investor, and so an investor then can choose to your shareholder can choose to either buy your stock again, and therefore increase your enterprise value, or do something else. True. And so basically, the way I think about it is that people who hold Berkshire stock, again, we're talking about the outlier, they hold it and are willing to hold it in near perpetuity because of this assumption that that enterprise is going to increase in value by the virtue of the business that they're in, which is sell promises and deliver on those promises and be strong investors. That is going to increase the enterprise value, and I'm going to participate in that ride by the virtue of just being a buy and hold investor in Berkshire. Whereas if you're a holder of another publicly listed insurer that has a shareholder base that doesn't seek that, but seeks a return of capital, you will definitionally never be able to achieve that enterprise value.
So, great point. I mean, that distinction about your investors influencing how you create value, right? Great point. Let's talk about investing at the individual level.
Yeah.
Like you and me, and interestingly, I have a big part of my portfolio in Berkshire Hathaway because
there you go.
I mean,
so you tell me, why do you hold Berkshire stock?
Because I think it. Well, firstly, I'm a big fan of Warren Buffett's. I believe he's got. I would love to create a Buffett bot. I like his process. I like his system of investing.
Okay, so I'd love to talk about this. Warren is an icon and a great investor, but you're such an analytical investor, and your work in general tends to try to derive the truth. And so I want to ask you this: how much of Warren Buffett's returns are the fact that he is Warren Buffett, i.e., how much of his return can be attributed to the fact that favorable situations, favorable opportunities come to him first in an asymmetric manner, not at first, but certainly later in his career, versus...
You mean like taking a position in Goldman?
Sure.
After the GFC, something like that?
I mean, that's an example. But in general, when, if you have a need for a strong shareholder to boost confidence or whatever it is, Warren is going to be at the top of that list. And of course, he's going to extract a price for that. That, to me, is enterprise value in itself, because he's able to achieve a brand. He has achieved a brand, a reputation that drives the opportunity set. That's pretty unique. And I have a hard time in my mind separating that from the mythology of the great investor. He's definitionally a great investor because he's able to achieve this clear competitive advantage. But he may not be analytically superior at this point than other investors. It's just that the way his business has evolved, the way he's managed his own presence and reputation in the marketplace, is a legitimate business advantage that he has, and therefore that his shareholders benefit and Berkshire benefits. But I struggle to tease apart the idea that he's analytically superior of an investor to anybody else versus this business model.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, I guess he goes through phases where he's superior and phases where he isn't. Right? So at one point, I remember his performance was almost doubled out of the market. It's sort of dwindled now. He's come off the boil a little. He's now 10 or 20%. So he has, he's had good periods and not so good periods. I guess, but his philosophy was really clear, right? He's buying quality as defined by these three factors, and he's not buying it expensive, right?
Yes.
He's a basement bargain kind of guy, right? So it sort of made sense as an investing philosophy, and and the results were sort of self-evident. Why I got reminded of this is because I was talking to someone else. I was in this conversation about how easy it is to get into something, but how hard it is to get out. Right? It's so hard to know when to get out
on both sides, by the way, regardless of which way the investment is performing.
Yeah, exactly. And which is why I'm not a big fan of discretionary investing. I teach a class on systematic investing for a reason, because I tell people, look, there's not too many humans who do consistently well at investing. There's all kinds of things that work against us as humans. And part of that is just like knowing when to get out, right? It requires like an incredible amount of diligence to sort of keep, monitoring the market. But interestingly, you said that you hold these in perpetuity. That's the way I view Berkshire. I have no intention of selling it, right? Now, 6 years ago, I told my systematic investing class, I said, I don't really believe in discretionary investing, but if you're going to do it, invest in, NVIDIA, Google, were my two big ones. I said, I'd go like all into these.
Oh, congratulations!
Well, I wish I'd gone all in. I went reasonably in, right? But that was my advice. And for Google, the advice was they don't have any customer service, right? Like, how many businesses do you know who don't give a damn about their customers, right? Because they have such an amazing product. Forget about customer service, right? Don't need that, right? And I actually had this experience where I tried calling Google customer service, and I got nowhere, right?
I've never even tried.
Exactly. Yeah, I was running an ad campaign and something was wrong. I just couldn't get to the bottom of it. And they said, just go away. We're busy. Come back later. And I told my class, I said, I bought a lot of Google stock after that, experience, because I was like, wow, I want to be in this business, but they don't give a shit about their
And you're still coming back.
Right? And I'm still coming back. Like, I'm not going anywhere. And NVIDIA is because Jensen Huang had just spoken at a conference here at NYU on the future of AI. And we'd organized the event, and I remember going to his talk and saying, wow, this is it, right? I don't see any competitors, and I still don't see any competitors, frankly, even though, the stock is up, 20-fold since that time. So
I should be asking you questions about how to invest.
Well, but what I was going to say is that the thing about NVIDIA is, I don't know, like, do I hold that in perpetuity? Probably not, right? Because one of the great myths about investing, I think, is find great companies and hold on to them, right? That's one of these things people say, find a great company. I like the first part, which is find a great company. And I think NVIDIA is a great company, Google is a great company, but not in perpetuity. I mean, these people they'll have their day in the sun, and, they'll wither away as well. And so that's the thing I find the hardest about discretionary investing, is just when to get out, right? And I struggle with NVIDIA. I mean, I had this conversation with Aswath Damodaran, who I think last year said it was priced for perfection, and the stock sold off 10% after he said that. And I, talked to him and I said, it's sold off, but I think it's because you said it, but I'm sure it's going to go up further because there's just all this, optimism. And he said, you're right, it probably will, which is why I only sold half of my position, right? Markets can be irrational, for long periods of time. But that's what I find really hard about discretionary stuff, which is why I try not to engage in it. And even as I have my NVIDIA position, I'm like, when do I get out?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it comes back to, you corrected me. It's not markets that are flawed. It's people that are flawed. In the end of the day, we are all incredibly susceptible, and I'd say more susceptible than ever, to stories and narratives, because we are bombarded by them, and they're amplified, and they are very difficult to ignore. You're inevitably going to end up talking about the topic of the day in some form, whether it's your class, whether it's your coworkers. Somebody's going to bring it up, and you're going to end up engaging in the topic of the day. And so stocks have that. Individual stocks in particular are always going to have that dynamic where they become a little bit gamified, rather than
like GameStop.
Exactly. And so underneath all the noise, there's a company. There are people, and you go back to the very core of the beauty of capitalism, which is you are able to take your savings and use those savings in a capital market, participate in the work and genius of others in growing a product. That's what the act of investing is. You're supplying capital for other individuals that are doing something with that capital that ultimately, hopefully, brings a greater enterprise value, betterment of society, etc. It's so easy to forget that. I mean, it's not interesting, right? Much more interesting to talk about the story of NVIDIA or whatever else. But I think if you go back and you look at the data, you'll find that, of course, companies turn over. Very, very few companies survive a true test of time. And even those that do, they don't always sit at the top of the tables, right? They're not always winning. Inevitably, someone comes along, disrupts them, or another competitor becomes stronger, whatever it is.
And very few have a second wind.
That's right.
Like Microsoft's been incredibly fortunate thanks to, Satya, having a second wind.
An incredible
but that is
wind.
Just like very rare.
That's right. And so I think what you point out is true, but it's so difficult to know when. And, NVIDIA, I think, is a fascinating example. So is frankly Apple. You look at the values of these companies, the dominance they have in their products, and you could have made this statement at any point in time about Apple over the past 5 years, but I see a $3 trillion company trading, at a substantial premium to other companies in the S&P 500, and I think that Apple trades at north of 25 times next year's earnings on a $3 trillion market cap, with revenues that have been very stagnant for now 2 to 3 years. And so it's difficult to be analytical about that and say that makes a lot of sense to me. But it's also an incomplete statement. It's infinitely complicated in terms of index values that Apple is in, and therefore getting the technical inflows into the stock, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's very hard to separate. And, whether it's NVIDIA or whether it's Apple, I don't know when to sell these things. But what I do know is, as a principle in investing, what you want to do is maximize the surface area of good outcomes versus bad outcomes. And I do think if you adopt that framework, it helps you make, at least, while certainly imperfect, at least reasonable decisions that you can have less regrets about over time and at scale. Because you're going to be wrong, be it on NVIDIA, you're going to be wrong on many things individually. But as a whole, when you try to avoid the absurdities, I think you'll over the long run you'll do well.
Yeah. So what is the advice you give people, like, a cocktail party? Because I had this December 2018, Christmas party. I was having, and one of my friends came to me and said, "Hey, I've got this money. What should I do?" Yeah. And the market has just sold off, almost 25%. Yeah. It was like a big sell-off. And I asked her. I said, "Do you know anything about markets?" She said, "No." I said, "Well, just put it all in the S&P. This is a great time." And she said, "Really? The market sold off?" I said, whenever it sold off 25%, if you get in and it's 25% down, in 3 years, you'll make 40%. Yeah. That's the average, and the variance around there is not that much. And that's sort of the advice I give people. Yeah. It's it's a personal thing, but if you don't know anything, just find a country you believe in and invest in its index, because people do the work for you of sifting through who's going to be kicked out and who's strong. I don't know. That just seems like so obvious in retrospect.
Yes, but see, this is it's fascinating. It goes back to my point of it's so hard to give people advice, and I always
which is why I said if you don't know anything.
But here, let me give it. But let's say, knowing nothing else, your advice in isolation is solid. By the way, right? You want to buy the S&P when it's down 20%, but what if this individual at the time has zero equity exposure and they just got a windfall, and you just told them to take all their money and buy a single point in the marketplace
and go to sleep?
and go to sleep. Well, that's not
don't ever look at it. Just go to sleep.
But it becomes a little bit less sound than if someone who has been investing for years and has accumulated a variety of assets at different prices. And so I think it's always very difficult because the question is always very simple. Like, what do I do with X? But the problem is that the simple answer really isn't complete to each individual's preferences, to each individual's totality of their investment history, et cetera, et cetera. I think it is true, though, the way I would try to, I try to avoid these questions, by the way, but the way I would try to answer that question is to say, like, look, your probabilities of losing money over a period of time when the S&P is down 20% are probably pretty low. Certainly nothing in history would say that over time this would be a bad idea. But if you're worried about the next 10%, I have nothing to say to you, and I wouldn't do everything at once then. And so I think that's the way I always try to make sure that people zoom out just a little bit from the particular point of discussion, because any single investment, beat into an index, beat into a private asset, beat into whatever, it's just a single investment. And our mind wants to go there and talk about that, but it's the broader picture that probably matters more.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, I wish I could follow my own advice.
I don't like talking about this either. Well, I avoid giving advice for lots of reasons because I made lots of mistakes in investing. But looking back, I look back and say, like there's something to be said for keeping it simple, as opposed to like just trying too hard and trying to make yourself believe something or believing what someone else is saying. It's just confusing out there.
Absolutely. But to be clear, I do think that there is a tremendous amount of value to be had in constructing appropriate portfolios. And this is a function of both discipline and analytical rigor, of understanding what is it that you're trying to accomplish with your capital base. Again, this is one of those things that sounds very simple, and it's the hardest thing to do, because just try doing that yourself, for yourself, never mind someone else. When you ask yourself that question, you'll have lots of conflicting answers. And then even if you are very diligent and good about deriving that clear investment objective for yourself, good luck staying disciplined, executing it. Because interesting things will come your way, et cetera, and the desire to participate and the temptation to deviate is extremely high. When you get to an institutional level, it's that much more complicated to do the simplest thing. In fact, again, that's the hardest thing to do. And so if you're able to, in many cases, simply not have unforced errors, you're already ahead of the game. Never mind, doing the diligence of understanding, again, what is it that the totality, what is the outcome that your capital seeks?
It's sort of a different sort of game at the institutional level. I mean, some of the principles are the same, like the portfolio level consideration, but you have to worry about the mandate, like you said, right? And really sticking to that, because you get sued. You're not following your mandate. And that's what, hedge funds are always sort of concerned about, are we following the mandate? So Vlad, I want to talk about leadership, because that's something that, many of my listeners are students, former students, young people, their careers ahead of them. What is it like? What's leadership really all about? You're a leader in a large organization, managing the investment side of the business. What does it mean? What does it involve?
A very good question. I think many people have tried to answer it. Look, I think leadership can be many different things. One of the things I think that is important is that when you're put in a position of authority, if you're put in a position where other people look to you for either vision or guidance or a difficult decision, it's important to be true to yourself.
The truth again,
because I think what happens is you walk through your career at many different points in time. First of all, you're influenced by a lot of different individuals in just creating the you of the time, right? Because you don't know the you of yourself 5 years from now. And I think when you look back every kind of decade or so, you see a different person. And so if you just are able to be yourself and true to yourself, you don't have to pretend to be someone else. You don't have to have a mold that you're trying to fit, whether that's a mold of always having the right answer or always delivering, a certain level of performance that people begin to expect from you. If you're just yourself and you're consistently yourself, I think that is a really important component of what a leader can be. The other part, I'll go back to what we talked about Gandhi, actually. And this is an important one for me personally, again, trying to stay true to myself. I believe in doing the right thing. And I say that not in a way of trying to signal virtue, because many things that I may believe that are the right thing, people may disagree with. It may not be virtuous to them. But I am an individual that at this point in my life, I know that if I do something that isn't true to who I am, isn't true to that inner voice, the way you talked about it, I'm not going to be able to sleep at night. I'm not going to be able to be myself. And so I think it's incredibly important to have people in positions of authority, in positions of leadership, who try to do the right thing, who are not going to simply be there to do the most expedient thing, the thing that is going to be most beneficial to them personally. I think of leadership, as something that where you as an individual are occupying an office. You should have incredible institutional ambition, but you should have personal modesty. You shouldn't conflate your office, whatever that is, with entitlement of being in that office. And I think that drives a certain way of thinking about the world. If you are ambitious for the institution, you are then going to domino into the many leadership principles that I think, a graduate business school would teach you. Of course, you want to surround yourself with exceptional people. But if you ended up in a position of leadership and all you care about is ultimately your own ambitions, I'd say, going back to that surface area of probabilities, it is not very likely that you're going to seek out and put in position the best team. Because what you're really going to be doing is putting a team in place that's going to get you to a place you aspire to be. As opposed to, if my aspiration is on behalf of the institution truly, to be something greater, to be something incredible, to seek excellence, well, then my mindset is different. And I'm going to seek out not just, people in my immediate surroundings, but through the organization as a whole that are going to embody that are going to drive and thrive on the concept of we are pushing this institution to new heights. And that can be a university, that could be a company, it could be anything else. And so I think a lot about these things. And, within my own organization, we've recently kind of narrowed in on what we describe as three cultural pillars, which I think embody a lot of that. First one is pursuit of uncompromising excellence. It's just as simple as that. We are stewards of capital of a large institution. People depend on us. And so anything less than uncompromising excellence is unacceptable. The second pillar is intellectual vitality. This one is an unbelievably important one, right? It's also topical to what we discussed in the search for truth, in the search for the best answer, in the ability to disagree. If you're going to have intellectual vitality in your organization, you're going to definitionally be in permanent search of the best solution. That's going to be an organization that's going to embody and never compromise on meritocracy. And by the way, meritocracy is not selecting the best answer from your inner circle. A meritocracy is seeking the best answer from as wide of a funnel as you can get. And so whatever principles, We want to include in that about the broad range of diversity that is required to ultimately achieve a meritocracy. Of course it is. Because a meritocracy ultimately is surfacing the best ideas. And that's what we're in the business of. You can't have intellectual vitality without a meritocracy. And then the third principle goes back to this idea of doing the right thing. And so we say our capital is going to be a capital as a force for good. That's not virtue signaling. That doesn't mean we are not going to that we're going to exclude a certain sector of investments or et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's trying to do the simple thing. We're going to do business and we're going to invest with and in to people, companies, partners, where we feel comfortable that these are individuals of integrity, engaged in businesses of integrity, that are ultimately a service to the broader fabric of society. Because our capital is important. It's powerful. We have influence. We will use that influence appropriately. We will use our capital as a force for good. And so through these three principles, I've tried to really express my beliefs about leadership. At least the way I think about leadership in the context of the organization and how I want to infuse that institutional ambition into my organization.
So where do people go wrong? Where do leaders go wrong?
So many different circumstances can drive outcomes for a leader. First of all, you don't hear about the leaders that fail. You only hear about the ones that succeed, or the mythology is always about the ones that succeed. But that success can be very much a function of circumstances at the time. There is no single leader for every situation. And I think this is also a core belief of mine. Be it a company, be it a country, be it any form of leadership. There's the individual who occupies the office with a particular set of skills, aptitudes, beliefs, values. And then there's the surrounding circumstances they're trying to engage with. You can sometimes have a set of circumstances that individual is perfectly suited to lead against. But you can also have that exact same individual with all the same aptitudes put into a situation where the circumstances are very different and they are no longer the optimal individual. And so I think companies and countries are probably the starkest examples of that. Take a president, a mythologized president. I don't know, take a John F. Kennedy. He was an incredible leader for the moment. In time. But what is to say that if he was the leader during the Civil War, that he would have been as effective as Lincoln? He may or may not have been, and vice versa. Lincoln may not have been as effective in the time frame that, in the circumstances that John Kennedy had to deal with. And so I think we think about leaders as this permanent entity that can handle everything, that can be the best leader in any kind of circumstance. And I think that's probably false.
So you're saying it's more of a fit?
I think the circumstances of whatever of what the leader is dealing with can drive outcomes, and some characteristics are going to drive better outcomes than not. And frankly, some of this is not a secret. I mean, if you are going to have, let's get practical. If you are dealing with a distressed company, right, you're going to want a particular management team in place, a particular set of expertise, versus a company that is thriving and is trying to figure out ways to take a step function in its journey. You've got people who are skilled in the former, in expense management, in consolidating, in basically surviving to live another day, versus another set of circumstances where you can afford and need to be much more aspirational, where you can drive ambition, et cetera. And so I think leaders fail for many different reasons. One of them is for sure that in many situations, they're just facing a set of circumstances that their style of leadership or their expertise is not optimal for. But the second part, I mean, let's be also very honest. I think that there are a tremendous amount of people that are ultimately put in leadership positions that are heavily over-anchored to personal ambition, and see things through that lens as opposed to that lens of the institution, the gravity of holding an office. Again, it could be a company, it could be a country, it could be a university. When you hold positions of consequence, you affect people's lives. If you occupy that office with that level of responsibility and see yourself as just a moment in time of trying to uphold this institution that you're navigating, that's a very different frame than one where you're there to put personal notches on your belt, achieve something for yourself. And I don't have a doubt that many, many people in leadership positions are ultimately over-anchored to personal ambition. And that will drive, I think, behavior that can have negative outcomes.
Pushing a little bit more on this notion of, leaders being right for a certain time and place, how are things different now from when you started your business career? Like what sort of advice would you give students who are, where you were 20 years ago? What's changed? What's the same? How would you tell them to think about their future?
So in terms of what's changed, I think the pace of acceleration is so much greater. So if going back to when I started my career, it seemed pretty reasonable for me to, at the time, see myself in a pretty linear career for, 10, 15, 20 years. I entered the Goldman Sachs analyst program. I knew exactly, kind of how that was going to work, et cetera, et cetera. I then ended up not living that linear career at all, but the expectation was there up front. I think now I can't imagine that you have the same even level of expectation. You are almost guaranteed to have many, many twists and turns in your career by the virtue of how fast the economy is evolving, how dynamic it is, how different sectors pop up. I mean, think about the last 20 years. The leading sectors in the economy today, in many cases, just didn't even exist 20 years ago. So I think number one, any notion of knowing what you're going to do is probably false and not necessarily the way I would tell anyone to plan for their career. When I think about like the most important thing I've learned over the years is the need to go and put yourself out there for other people to see you, for other people to take interest in you, and not believing that this is going to happen magically. It will not. I say this from experience, and I say this from advice I've given in countless situations I've observed, where many high achievers assume that they will be, so to speak, graded on their work. They will be seen because of the quality of their work, whatever that may be. But that's never sufficient. It's never been sufficient for anyone, and it will not be sufficient for anyone, because it is an assumption that what you do is very important to you, and it may be done at a very high level, but to the person that may be a stakeholder in your career, may be a sponsor, well, they've got 1,000 different other things. You're just a sliver of their attention span. And so your assumption and the amount of headspace you think you own there is much, much lower than what there's a huge difference there. And so I think that the sooner a person starting their career is able to differentiate between what is clumsy self-promotion, which is a very bad idea, and the notion of making sure that a broad group of people is aware of what you do, of what your interests are, of what you may offer them, the quicker you will accelerate in identifying what it is that you want to focus on, and ultimately thriving. Creating those stakeholders is hard work, and it's uncomfortable. Because when you're starting out, it always will feel like self-promotion. Like, how do I go and tell someone about what I do? Or how do I make them understand how important this is? It takes time, but it's so important. It's so important not to assume that just the work itself is enough for people to take an interest in you. And the work itself is just a rung on the ladder too, right? Because at every point in time when you do good work and we're able to showcase it, you're only looking to do the next great thing. And that next great thing is going to be serendipity. It's going to be because someone sees, oh, well, this is an individual that's skilled and interesting. I've got this idea of something you can look into, or I can connect you to this person. And I fundamentally believe most people want to help, and most people want to be stakeholders. But there's this major gap between the assumption that they have to be your stakeholders versus the work you need to do to actually make them stakeholders. And once you accomplish that, it's a flywheel. People all of a sudden begin to see your work. They begin to seek your expertise, and you become its muscle memory. You become much more skilled in telling the story of whatever it is that you do and what you're passionate about and how it's relevant to others.
That's really well put, Vlad. You know, one of my earlier guests on the show was Michael Roth, who's the president of Wesleyan. And I asked him, what is the goal of higher education, right? And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, he said, the goal is to maximize the number of serendipitous encounters, you know, that you have on campus. You know, that is, you know, that's the objective. Like, just push yourself in the place where you maximize that. And I think what you're saying is that doesn't stop. You know, it's just sort of, it continues.
Well,
right?
in fact, it's harder, right? Because on a campus, and I love that.
It is harder, exactly.
I love that. On a campus, that is the point of the campus. The point of the campus is to bring together a group of people who have aspirations and to study and to seek knowledge and truth, and they interact with each other, and that's how progress happens. I think that's the conversation you and I had. Once you get into a company setting, actually, though, it is infinitely more narrow because especially when you're starting out, you have your boss, right? And maybe you have 2 or 3 other people that are within kind of your visibility, and there's a hierarchy. And your universe is big. I like to describe it as the universe is big. And, you know, there's someone who's really, really senior. They're far away. But as you progress through your career, the universe shrinks. And you first of all stop mythologizing those individuals, and you see all the flaws and, you know, like anything else like you discover in your parents as you grow up.
Closely enough.
Yeah. And so you have to do the work. The serendipity will happen if you do the work, but don't assume that it's just going to fall into your lap or you will, you know, walk easily on a linear path. Because most people don't actually want the linear path. You know, ambitious people want the exponential path. And the exponential path is a whole lot of serendipity along the way. But most of those people made it happen.
Great point. Great point to end on, Vlad. And strangely enough, it ties back into many of the things that, you know, Gandhi talks about. But we'll talk about that over dinner.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, just to make the point. Imagine on leaders and circumstances. Imagine, you know, a leader like Gandhi, who was able to inspire a nation through nonviolent means, versus a leader like Churchill, who certainly did not believe in nonviolence, fought in many different wars himself, and the time and the circumstances, and reverse them. And are they the right leaders for those circumstances? So sorry to interrupt that perfect ending, but I was waiting to make that point as we were speaking. I really think individuals fit certain eras, certain moments in time, and that's what drives outcomes.
All right, Vlad, it's been a fun conversation. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Pleasure to be here back on campus, and looking forward to dinner as well.
Sounds good.